November 19, 1942. Stalingrad. A single Soviet sergeant crouched inside a gutted four-story apartment building, surrounded by 37,000 square meters of rubble, German encirclement pressing from three sides, and a supply line reduced to a crawl across the Volga River under shell fire. He had 11 men, then 7, then 4. By the end, the Germans would dedicate more resources to eliminating one building than they had spent capturing entire Polish cities in 1939. His name was Yakov Pavlov, and the building that bore his name became the most strategically significant 28 meters of real estate in the entire Stalingrad campaign. To understand how one sergeant and a shrinking handful of men held what military historians would later call Pavlov's house for 58 consecutive days, not 37, not 40, but 58 days. You need to understand what Stalingrad had become by autumn 1942. This was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was something else entirely. Something the German High Command had not planned for and could not resolve despite every tactical advantage they theoretically possessed. By September of 1942, the German 6th Army under Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus had pushed deep into the city. The original plan, capture Stalingrad swiftly, secure the Volga River crossing, and cut Soviet supply routes to the Caucasus, had degenerated into what German soldiers bitterly called Rattenkrieg, rat war, street by street, floor by floor, room by room. The wide-open steppe warfare that German doctrine had been built around, the blitzkrieg philosophy of speed and mechanized envelopment, was utterly useless in a city reduced to rubble. The rubble itself became Soviet armor. Every collapsed wall was a fortification. Every burned-out factory was a fortress. And the closer the Germans pushed toward the Volga, the shorter the Soviet defensive lines became, concentrating more defenders into tighter, more defensible terrain. The 62nd Soviet Army, commanded by General Vasily Chuikov, had developed a brutal tactical doctrine for exactly this environment. He called it hugging the enemy. The principle was deceptively simple and lethally effective. Keep your forward defensive positions so close to the German lines that their artillery and air support could not strike without hitting their own men. The Luftwaffe, which had obliterated much of Stalingrad's civilian infrastructure with roughly 1,000 tons of bombs in a single day on August 23rd, was suddenly neutralized as a tactical weapon in close urban combat. Chuikov's men paid for this doctrine in blood, but it worked. The Germans were stripped of their most decisive advantages, air power and artillery, and forced to fight with rifles, grenades, and bayonets in the same claustrophobic rooms as the defenders. Into this environment, on September 27, 1942, a 2-2-man reconnaissance platoon under Junior Lieutenant Ivan Afanasyev was ordered to investigate a 4-story apartment building on the 9th of January Square, a wide-open plaza that sat approximately 300 meters from the Volga River's western bank. The building had once housed civilian workers of the Stalingrad industrial complex. Now it was a burned shell, but its position was extraordinary. From the upper floors, a clear line of sight extended across the entire square and along several key German approach corridors. Whoever held this building controlled observation of a massive chunk of the southern defensive zone. Afanasyev secured the building and immediately grasped what he had. He did not wait for orders to fortify it. He organized his men into rotating watch positions, designated fields of fire for each window, and sent back a detailed report of the building's defensive potential, along with a request for heavier weapons. These decisions, made by a junior lieutenant on his own initiative without any senior officer present, were the foundation everything else was built on. When Pavlov arrived 3 days later, he inherited not just a position, but a functioning defensive concept. 3 days later, Sergeant Yakov Pavlov arrived with a 4-man scouting party. Pavlov was 26 years old, from a collective farming village in the Novgorod region, and had been at the front since the German invasion began on June 22, 1941. He was not a celebrated hero. He was not an officer. He was exactly the kind of man the Eastern Front produced in vast numbers. Competent, experienced, hardened beyond what any peacetime soldier could recognize, and utterly unafraid to make independent decisions when officers were unavailable or dead. When Pavlov reached the building, Afanasyev's platoon had already sustained casualties. Pavlov secured the lower floors, confirmed the building's tactical value, and sent a runner back to the 42nd Guards Rifle Regiment requesting reinforcements and heavy weapons. What he got was not a company, not even a platoon. Over the following 4 days, small groups of reinforcements were fed into the building in 1s and 2s, crawling across the rubble-strewn open ground at night to avoid German observation. By the time the full garrison was assembled, Pavlov commanded approximately 25 men, But these were not 25 ordinary riflemen. They were a composite force drawn from multiple Soviet nationalities and units: Russians, Ukrainians, Georgians, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Tatars, and a Jewish soldier named Moshe Weinberg, who handled much of the communication equipment. Soviet historians would later make much of this multinational composition, and while some of that framing carried propaganda undertones, the basic fact stands. These men came from different languages, different cultures, and different military backgrounds, and they functioned as a coherent fighting unit under conditions that would have dissolved most organized formations. The weapons they brought with them represented the full toolkit of Soviet urban combat. 2 Maxim machine guns, the Model 1910, a weapon that had been in Soviet service since the First World War, water-cooled, belt-fed, capable of sustained fire at 600 rounds per minute, cumbersome, heavy at 23 kilograms including a wheeled mount, and requiring constant maintenance but devastatingly effective at suppressing open ground. They also carried PTRD-41 anti-tank rifles, single-shot 14.5mm caliber weapons designed to defeat light German armored vehicles and half-tracks at ranges up to 500 meters. Each round weighed nearly 200 grams and could punch through 40 millimeters of rolled steel at 100 meters. Against German panzers, the PTRD-41 was largely useless at the hull. But against tracks, vision ports, and lighter reconnaissance vehicles, it was more than adequate. More critically, the anti-tank rifle was lethal against positions concealed behind light cover. A German machine gun nest behind a half-collapsed brick wall offered no protection against a 14.5mm round. For close quarters work, Pavlov's garrison relied on PPSh-41 submachine guns, the weapon that had become synonymous with Soviet urban combat. The PPSh-41 fired a 7.62mm pistol cartridge at 900 rounds per minute from a 71-round drum magazine, and it could be field stripped in under a minute without tools. Soviet manufacturing records show that by 1942, factories across the Ural industrial region were producing approximately 3,000 PPSh-41 units per day. The weapon was not elegant. The Germans, who encountered it constantly, were dismissive at first, calling it a peasant's weapon, a crude, stamped metal device compared to the more refined German MP-40. But in a burned apartment building where the longest engagement distance was 30 meters, 900 rounds per minute from a 71-round drum was not a peasant's weapon. It was exactly the right weapon for exactly the right environment. Pavlov understood this building the way a chess player understands a board. Every window became a firing position. Every doorway became a kill zone. The basement was dug out and reinforced to serve as an ammunition store and aid post. Trenches were excavated through the courtyard connecting the building to adjacent ruins, giving the garrison covered lines of retreat and reinforcement. Critically, Pavlov ordered the ground floor windows bricked up with rubble, leaving only narrow slits for weapons. This forced any German assault to approach through upper story windows, which required ladders and rope in plain sight of Soviet defenders, or through a single entry point that could be covered by multiple weapons simultaneously. The Germans first probed the building on October 1, 1942. A reconnaissance element from the German 71st Infantry Division approached the square in daylight, apparently assuming the building was either unoccupied or lightly held. The Maxim opened up from the second floor at approximately 200 meters. The probe dissolved. German command noted the building as contested terrain and registered it for artillery attention. That night, 105mm shells impacted the building's outer walls 3 times. The walls held. Built in the 1930s Soviet constructivist style, the building's brick walls were 60 centimeters thick in places. Not impenetrable. Nothing in Stalingrad was impenetrable, but sufficient to absorb direct hits without immediate structural collapse. Over the next week, the pattern established itself. German patrols would approach the square at night. Pavlov sentries would detect movement through listening posts positioned in the rubble beyond the building's perimeter, and the defenders would open fire with concentrated submachine gun and machine gun bursts before withdrawing back into the building. The Soviets did not fight from fixed positions. They moved constantly, using multiple firing slits to make German observers believe the garrison was larger than it was. Pavlov reportedly instructed his men to change positions after every burst, to leave dummy rifles propped in windows, and to fire from different floors in rapid succession. German intelligence estimates of the garrison fluctuated wildly. At various points, the 6th Army's intelligence summaries assessed Pavlov's house as being held by anywhere from 40 to 200 Soviet troops. The first major German assault came on October 8th. A company strength force, roughly 80 to 100 soldiers, crossed the square at dawn under artillery preparation. 3 shells landed within the building itself before the infantry advanced, collapsing a section of the 3rd floor and wounding 2 defenders. Then the German infantry reached the open ground of the square. Here, the Maxims had been repositioned to the ground floor firing slits, not the 2nd floor where German observers had previously tracked them. The enfilade fire cut across the square from 2 angles simultaneously. The German assault folded within 4 minutes. Later estimates counted 28 German bodies left on the square when the firing stopped. But every assault cost something, and by mid-October the ledger was turning grim. Pavlov's garrison was bleeding. By mid-October, the 5-man force had been reduced to 13 effectives through death and wounds. Supply runs across the Volga were becoming more dangerous as German artillery zeroed in on crossing points. On some nights, no resupply reached the building at all. The garrison rationed ammunition by weapon type. The Maxims were to be reserved for major assaults, the anti-tank rifles for armored probes, and the PPSh-41 drums were to be fired only in bursts of 5 rounds, never sustained. Pavlov himself took a shrapnel wound to the leg in mid-October that was treated in the basement with sulfanilamide powder and bandages. He did not evacuate. There was nowhere to evacuate to that didn't expose him to worse fire than staying put. The most dangerous moment came on November 3, 1942. German engineers, recognizing that frontal assault across the open square was prohibitively costly, attempted to mine the building's foundation from a neighboring ruined structure. A Soviet sentry in the rubble trenches detected movement and the sound of digging at approximately 0300 hours. Pavlov organized a raiding party of 4 men, grenades only, no firearms, who crawled through the connecting trenches and hit the German engineer position with hand grenades before the mine could be placed. 2 Soviet soldiers were wounded in the action. All 4 German engineers were killed. The building stood, what the German command never fully appreciated, and what makes Pavlov's defense historically significant beyond the simple narrative of endurance was the tactical geometry his position controlled. From the building's upper floors, Soviet observers could track German troop movements across a 270-degree arc covering the southern approach to the central Volga crossing. Every German reinforcement column, every supply wagon, every tank that moved through that section of the city was observed and reported. The building was not just a defensive position, it was a forward observation post that fed targeting data to Soviet artillery on the Volga's eastern bank. And that artillery made German daytime movement through the surrounding streets catastrophically expensive. German officers, who later documented the campaign, noted with evident frustration that the approaches to the Volga seemed to have eyes in every direction, and many of those eyes were in the 4-story building they could not capture. On November 19, 1942, the 37th day of Pavlov's continuous occupation of the building, the strategic situation across the entire Stalingrad theater shifted with volcanic suddenness. Operation Uranus, the massive Soviet counteroffensive, planned in secrecy over the preceding months, launched simultaneously from the north and south of the German salient. Within 4 days, the Soviet 5th Tank Army and the 57th Army had completed an encirclement that trapped the German 6th Army, roughly 265,000 men, inside the Stalingrad pocket. The besiegers became the besieged, and Pavlov's house, which had been a desperate, isolated outpost clinging to the Volga's edge, was suddenly inside the operational security of a Soviet army that was no longer retreating. The garrison held through the encirclement and through the brutal winter that followed. Temperatures in Stalingrad dropped to -30 degrees Celsius in December 1942, and the Germans inside the pocket, lacking the winterized equipment that Soviet troops had been issued, began dying of exposure in numbers that rivaled combat casualties. Soviet soldiers received felt boots, called valenki, padded jackets, and white camouflage covers. German soldiers in summer weight uniforms stuffed newspaper inside their tunics for insulation and wrapped their feet in whatever cloth they could find. The cold was not an equal adversary. For soldiers who had been fighting in it since 1941, who had winterized their weapons with special low-viscosity lubricants and knew to keep rifle bolts close to their bodies to prevent the metal contracting in the cold and jamming, the winter was survivable. For soldiers who expected to be home by Christmas 1941 and were now entering their second Russian winter without proper equipment, it was a killing field that required no Soviet bullets. Pavlov's house was officially relieved on November 25, 1942, when advancing Soviet units from the newly strengthened 62nd Army pushed through the surrounding streets and established firm contact with the garrison. By then, Yakov Pavlov had held the building for 58 days, the final count of German casualties in direct assaults on the building alone. separate from the broader attritional losses in the surrounding area, has been debated by historians, but Soviet records from the 13th Guards Rifle Division's operational logs document at least 4 company-strength assaults and dozens of smaller probes, with total German losses attributed to the building's defense conservatively estimated at over 400 killed. Pavlov's garrison of 25 men had suffered 11 dead and numerous wounded. General Vasily Chuikov, in his post-war memoir, wrote that the German forces had lost more men attacking Pavlov's house than they had used to seize the entire city of Paris in 1940. That comparison is almost certainly rhetorical exaggeration for effect. Paris fell in 4 days with minimal fighting. But Chuikov's point was not arithmetic. It was moral. The defensive philosophy that produced Pavlov's house, decentralized initiative, individual tactical creativity, intimate knowledge of terrain, the willingness to hold ground not because an order said to hold it, but because the soldier holding it understood why it mattered, was the philosophical backbone of the entire Stalingrad defense. Pavlov survived the war. He was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union title in 1945. He returned to farming after demobilization, later entered the Russian Orthodox Seminary, and lived until 1981. In interviews given in his later years, he was consistently uncomfortable with the mythologized version of the defense that Soviet propaganda had constructed around his name. He spoke about the other men, Afanasyev, who had first recognized the building's potential and made the initial defensive decisions before Pavlov ever arrived, the Kazakh soldiers who held the northern staircase, the Georgian machine gunner who kept the Maxim firing through 3-barrel changes under direct fire. Pavlov understood, even if Soviet historians sometimes forgot, that the building was not held by a hero. It was held by a group, and it started with a lieutenant named Afanasyev, who looked at a burned shell of an apartment block and saw a fortress. The German post-action analysis of the Stalingrad campaign, compiled by surviving 6th Army officers in Soviet captivity between 1943 and 1945, identified urban combat adaptation as the single greatest tactical failure of the German forces in the city. Specifically, the failure to recognize the defensive multiplier created by fortified buildings controlling open ground. The Pavlov's house problem, as some officers termed it, had cost the 6th Army staggering casualties it could not replace. The lesson was clear to any military planner who studied it honestly. In urban terrain, a handful of determined defenders with the right weapons and the right position can neutralize forces 50 times their number. This was not a Soviet discovery. Every military tradition in history had examples of similar actions. But the Eastern Front compressed these lessons into a scale and intensity that made them impossible to ignore. The broader strategic outcome of the Stalingrad campaign is well documented. The German 6th Army surrendered on February 2, 1943. Field Marshal Paulus, the first German field marshal ever to surrender to an enemy force, walked out of the ruins of the city's department store basement into Soviet captivity along with 91,000 surviving soldiers, all that remained of the force that had once numbered 265,000. The Wehrmacht would never again launch a major strategic offensive in the east. The balance of the war shifted permanently on the steppe outside Stalingrad, and in the ruins of Stalingrad itself, and in small, desperate actions like the one fought in a 4-story apartment building by a sergeant from Novgorod who decided that this particular building, at this particular moment, was worth dying for. But there is a detail about Pavlov's house that almost no documentary covers, and it matters. After the battle, Soviet engineers surveyed the damage to the building's structure. Despite months of artillery bombardment, direct infantry assault, and the general devastation of the surrounding district, the building's load-bearing walls remained fundamentally intact. The 60-centimeter Soviet constructivist brick construction had absorbed direct 105mm shell impacts and survived. This was not luck. The German artillery observers, working from positions that had to account for their own troops in the surrounding streets, had been unable to bring the heaviest available artillery to bear without risk of hitting their own forward elements. Chuikov's hugging doctrine, even in a building defense context, had worked precisely as designed. The garrison's survival was not entirely a testament to individual heroism, though that heroism was real. It was also a testament to a defensive system, conceived at army level, executed at the smallest unit level, that exploited every constraint the urban environment imposed on German firepower. This is the Eastern Front's most underappreciated lesson. Soviet military adaptation was not slow, not clumsy, not the product of a system that compensated for quality with quantity. At Stalingrad, at the tactical level, the Red Army outthought its opponent. Pavlov's house was a microcosm of that larger truth. 13 exhausted soldiers with 2 machine guns and a pile of brick held the German 6th Army's veterans at bay for nearly 2 months because they understood their ground better, used their weapons more intelligently, and believed in the objective with a conviction that no order could manufacture. Some things, it turns out, you cannot engineer around. If that story stayed with you, the weight of those 58 days, the cold, the dark stairwells, the shrapnel, and the silence, there's another one waiting. 900 kilometers north, Soviet sailors were dropped onto Lake Ladoga's frozen surface to cut a supply corridor to Leningrad through 2 meters of ice, German air attack, and a lake that could swallow a truck whole. Same war, same stakes. A completely different kind of hell. That's next week on WWW2 Storyverse. And if you don't want to miss it, subscribe now. The Eastern Front has barely started.